the introduction and for the invitation to come to your beautiful country to participate in this conversation. What I'm going to do is give a brief overview of the different kind of investor immigration programs that have been introduced worldwide, looking at why it is that governments have turned to these programs, how they work, and what the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of models for investor or commercial immigration are. You may be aware that there is a growing number of programs that admit foreign investors that have been introduced around the world. They have been introduced by a number of different types of countries. We see them quite often in the high-income English-speaking countries like the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada. There are a number in the Caribbean islands as well, most notably St. Kitts, which has had a program for several decades. And more recently, there have been an increasing number in the European Union. The goals of these programs are to stimulate job creation or to create government revenues. And one of the reasons that they've become particularly popular over the last few years is because governments have, in light of the financial crisis, are trying to find more ways either to raise revenues or to create jobs in the face of rising unemployment. It's worth bearing in mind when thinking about these immigration models that there's a lot of different policy choices that can be made, and there's huge variation in the design of these policies. So some of the investor programs in some countries have very little in common with investor programs in others, and I'm going to explain a little bit about how those different programs work and what the choices are. It's worth just mentioning on the other side of the equation, when you're looking at the people applying to the program, there is a growing demand here as well. China is the #1 country of origin for investors. There's growing wealth in China. There are more than 1.3 million families now in China that have private wealth of more than $1 million US, and that rate is growing quite quickly. I just will say a few things about why it is that people apply to investor programs. Most of my presentation is going to be about how the programs are designed and what governments ask of investors. But it's worth bearing in mind that there are a number of different reasons that people want to participate. The first is traditional immigration motive. People want to settle usually in a higher income country than the one that they're from. They settle abroad with their families. Often the motivation is to give better opportunities for their children growing up, and so forth. Many of the people, however, who apply don't necessarily want to move right away. They want to have a second residence right, or passport in some cases, as a kind of insurance policy. So they are happy living where they are, but they're worried, especially if they're in a country with some economic or political uncertainty. They're worried about where the country is going, and so they want to keep their options open for the future and know that they can leave if they want to. Another common motivation for applying for investor programs is to get visa-free travel in other countries. If you're a citizen of China, for example, you have to apply for a visa to visit as a businessman to any vast majority of OECD countries. But if you have a passport or sometimes permanent residence from another high-income country, that facilitates the process of travel and makes it easier to conduct business. Then, fourth common motivation is taxation, in order the desire to establish oneself in a low-tax jurisdiction. And of course, many people have a number of different motivations and would consider all of these factors when they're applying. From the perspective of the community that's creating an investor program, there are a number of questions that have to be considered when working out whether this is a program that makes sense and what type of program they would want to introduce. The first is what kind of investments the program is designed to encourage, and I'll talk a little bit about the different options there. I'll then talk about the second major issue, which is to what extent the programs are going after residents who will settle permanently, or whether they allow people to be more loosely attached to the country and to come and go without having to actually move and settle there. And then there are also, finally, I'll talk about a number of issues around the integrity of the programs, making sure that they don't admit people with criminal backgrounds or who have raised their money illegally. So on this first question about what type of investments these programs involve, there are two major models that are worth bearing in mind. The first is what I'm going to call a traditional model, and that is one that encourages private sector investments in a specific business or sometimes in a set of businesses. The goal of this program is not to raise revenues for the government, it's to boost foreign direct investment and to introduce businesses into the economy or to grow businesses in the economy that will create jobs. It's the most common model in high-income countries. It's probably best known in the United States. It's also the only model that's available in Singapore, the Netherlands, and France. But almost all countries that have some form of investor immigration allow this as an option. In the United States, for example, you can apply for what's known as an EB-5 visa, and if you invest $500,000 US in an area that is what they call a targeted employment area where there's considered not to be a sufficient number of jobs, then you can receive a conditional green card. Then after a couple of years, if you demonstrate that you've created at least 10 jobs through your investment, you would be able to apply for a full green card, and then a number of years later you can apply for citizenship. In Singapore, there's a somewhat similar structure, but you have to invest significantly more. It's around about $2 million US, 2.5 million Singapore dollars. And that can be invested either through a fund that manages the investment for you, or you can invest directly in a business. Then, in order to renew the permanent resident status that you would get from that in Singapore, you would also have to demonstrate a certain level of job creation, and people can also apply for citizenship through the program, but they wouldn't get it immediately. Now, the benefit of this program, the reason that governments have introduced them is to encourage job creation. It does have a number of risks as well. One of them is that the investment that people put in can be withdrawn after a certain amount of time. Once people have a non-conditional status, it's then difficult for the government to control whether they take their money out of the country again. There are sometimes some issues around how we decide which which businesses will receive money from investors. This has to be done either through the political process, so it may, for example, be a decision made by the government which projects can be eligible to receive investor money. In other cases, it's delegated to the private sector, and there's an application process. In many cases, this works fine. There are other cases where there are accusations of political interference in the determination of which projects get money, or there are concerns that people apply for investor money and mislead investors into putting their money in projects that are either fraudulent or that have very low returns and that they weren't given full information. On a related note, one of the risks of these programs is that it can be difficult to monitor compliance with the requirements. There are generally a number of requirements that investors have to meet, and they may demonstrate these on paper, but it's sometimes difficult to know whether they're genuinely fulfilling the goals of the program and creating the number of jobs that were expected, and so forth. The final issue that sometimes arises with these programs is that if you give someone an immigration benefit, like a residence permit or even citizenship, on the basis of a financial transaction that they're making, it may encourage them to be less thoughtful in the business decisions that they make. Normally, an investor would scrutinize very carefully what the return is on the investment, for example. Some of the criticisms that arise with these programs is that when what they really are getting out of it is an immigration benefit, they're not necessarily going to invest in the businesses that most need capital. So that's the private sector investment model. A second model is completely different. I'm going to call it the cash model. And this is essentially where the investor gives a non-refundable donation to a government fund of some kind. This is the model that is best known in the Caribbean. So Kitts and Nevis has operated a program along these lines since 1984. It's also been around for some time in Dominica, and much more recently in Antigua and Grenada. There is a program that's under development in Malta, which would allow, for the first time, investors to essentially purchase citizenship for €650,000. The government of Malta is introducing this program. It's still not 100% sure whether it will go ahead. But if it does go ahead, their plan is to issue 1,800 passports that would raise about €1 billion in a country with a GDP of about €7 billion. The benefit from the government perspective of these programs is that It allows them to raise revenues that can be used for various different public investments. It can be used for paying down public debt. It can also be used to invest in things where it's much more difficult to attract private investment. So it can be used, for example, for roads and schools and hospitals, which would not necessarily be the case for the private sector ones. It can also, of course, be used to give loans to businesses, or it can be used to stimulate private sector investments of other kinds. But it has a little more flexibility than the first model I discussed. The drawbacks of this model are that, first, the impact that it has on revenues may not be sustainable. It's difficult to project how many people will apply over time, and even a country that has a lot of applicants now may not have as many later. So there's a risk that it provides a one-time influx of money, but that would necessarily have enduring impacts if the applicant stream then starts to fall away. The second major criticism of these programs is that because it is a much more direct financial transaction between the government and an investor, they're much more vulnerable to both domestic and international criticism. They bring up people's discomfort with the idea of selling citizenship. I'll just briefly mention a couple of other designs of programs that one comes across reasonably often. I think from an economic perspective, their benefits are a little more questionable. The first is encouraging investors to buy government bonds, but these will be ordinary interest-bearing government bonds. This program exists in the UK, for example. You can, if you spend £750,000 in UK government bonds and also buy a house for at least £250,000, then you can be eligible for a temporary residence permit and ultimately to get permanent residence and citizenship after a number of years. They have similar programs with slightly higher thresholds in Australia. Those programs don't necessarily have an economic benefit from the actual investment that's made itself, because these countries don't really need any more buyers for their government bonds. What they're primarily doing is finding a way to admit wealthy individuals who are then expected to contribute to the economy in other ways by setting up businesses that would create jobs or through their spending in the country. The final model that's worth mentioning is that a number of countries offer residence permits of some kind to people who buy property in their country. This is particularly the case in some European countries. It's a relatively new model that has been introduced over the last few years, and again, I think the benefits are not that clear. It may increase house prices. It's not immediately obvious whether or not that is a good thing to do. But it has a similar impact to the government bond option in that it brings in people who are wealthy, who can afford the high-end houses that they have to buy through the program, and the idea is that they might contribute. My own view on this is that the first two programs that require a more direct investment in the economy are a little more useful from an economic perspective. So the second set of questions that come up is around whether people have to live in the country where they acquire investor status. Now, there's a huge range of different programs, as I discussed. Some of them offer citizenship immediately. That's the case, for example, in St. Kitts and Nevis, where depending on the family size, you can acquire citizenship for around about $250,000. That essentially means that if you have citizenship, it's generally an unconditional status, and so it means that you have no obligation to live in the country that gives you citizenship. Another type of program that also doesn't really require people to live in the country gives a temporary status, so it's much less than citizenship. But that status can be maintained over time while making only relatively limited visits to the country. That's the case in a number of the European countries, often the same ones that have the property-based model that I discussed a second ago. Now, the third type of model, which is a more traditional type of program and tends to be used in the popular immigrant destinations, particularly the English-speaking high-income countries, is to require people to live in the country for a substantial amount of time if they want to remain in the program. So typically these programs would give some kind of temporary status up front, and then assuming that the person maintains their investment, they would be able to receive a non-conditional status like permanent residence after about somewhere between 2 and 5 years in most cases. And then they would have to apply for citizenship after that, generally with the same conditions for applying to citizenship would apply as would apply to other people who come through other routes, like for marriage, for example. Now, during that conditional period, it's possible to impose some restrictions on what people do in order to continue to be eligible for the program. And so a number of countries have residence requirements that specify the amount of time someone has to spend essentially demonstrating their attachment to that country. These vary between the programs, somewhere between 10 and 50% of the year in most cases. And it's when designing these programs, it's difficult. There's no optimal amount of time that people should be required to spend in the country. On the one hand, the higher the residence requirement, the more likely it is that the program will attract people who are going to be actively involved in the local economy and people who are going to contribute their business expertise. On the other hand, having a strong residence requirement does make the program less attractive, and we've been there are fewer applicants. It makes it less attractive, firstly because people, high-flying businessmen need to travel, and some of them travel quite a lot. It's also less attractive because some of the benefits that they're looking for in the program only come with citizenship, particularly if they're looking for a program that gives them visa-free travel access. They're unlikely to get the benefits of that without having full citizenship status. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the controversies around these programs. If you have a program that requires, a conditional program that requires you to spend a significant amount of time in the country, that looks essentially like traditional immigration. And it tends to be relatively uncontroversial. The programs have a pretty good international reputation. In order to have a program like that, the country needs to be a sufficiently popular destination to attract people who are willing to actually live there. On the other hand, particularly in countries where people don't actually want to settle, the programs do not have any meaningful residence requirements, and that makes them a little more controversial because they're then open to the criticism that this is essentially a financial transaction selling citizenship. Internationally, one of the reasons that this may be important is that there's sometimes a concern that what they're really doing is selling access to other countries, particularly selling access to visa-free travel. Now, the worst case scenario from that perspective is that if a program does not have a good reputation and it's considered that people with, for example, criminal backgrounds are coming in through it in order to access visa-free travel in other countries, countries that currently offer visa-free travel may stop doing so. This is a relatively rare scenario, but it's worth bearing in mind. I think, firstly, it's very important to have the due diligence and background checks on individuals that people believe in, and have a program that is managed well and in a transparent fashion, where it's clear that people aren't obtaining immigration benefits based on, for example, political connections with people in the government. That said, it's worth bearing in mind that it's not possible to conduct background checks so thorough that you can guarantee there will be no suspicious individuals coming through the program. In theory, these programs, they don't need to be perfect. They need to be good enough to create confidence among other countries that the screening is sufficient. In all likelihood, the people coming through it are honest individuals, which the vast majority will be. That said, if you have a substantial number of people applying for a program, you can't exclude the possibility that there will be some kind of scandal would emerge where an individual who's received citizenship, for example, through a program, then uses it to access another country and is engaged in criminal activities. And so there's some vulnerability, especially I think all immigration is somewhat vulnerable to these kind of scandals and criticism because it's a sensitive area of policy. This is particularly the case for investor immigration. That said, I think that these concerns really apply to citizenship programs that offer citizenship straight away, and to programs that don't really have residence requirements. If you have a residence a program that requires people to establish themselves, to become involved in the local economy and so forth, it really neutralizes a lot of the concern about people with criminal backgrounds coming through the program, because then it gets back into the traditional terrain of immigration, and other countries accept that that countries have a right to choose their own immigrants and admit people to their societies, and will not necessarily hold them responsible for all of their misdemeanors. So just by way of summary, I would say I think it's very important for the goals of the program to be clearly defined. As I hope I have conveyed, there's a large number of different ways of designing these programs, and the type of program, if any, that would make sense for a country to introduce will depend on whether they're looking to bring in people who will contribute actively with their business expertise, whether the goal is revenue raising in the shorter term, and what types of investments they want to encourage. Just to summarize the cash-based citizenship programs, the benefit of these programs is that they can provide very significant revenues, especially in the small economy, and there's a lot of flexibility as to how those revenues can be spent. On the negative side, they're much more controversial, and there is this small but unquantifiable risk of losing visa-free travel rights if the process of due diligence is not considered to be sufficient. On the other hand, the private sector investment model that imposes residence requirements would get a much smaller number of applicants. A lot of people are not willing to spend that time in the country, and so it requires much more of the investor. It's also a little bit harder, as I alluded to earlier, it's a little bit harder to control what the economic impacts of the programs are to determine exactly where the investments go. That said, they're more likely to admit people with expertise, people who are going to make an active contribution. And as a result, especially some of the more popular immigration destinations, the UK and Australia, I think that's the trajectory in which they're going. They're trying to push their programs more towards policies that will admit individuals whose expertise is needed, rather than relying purely on the transaction, the investment that they will be making. And I would be happy to answer any questions that
Yeah, you can have a seat. Well, there's twice as many people here now than when we started, so I'll just say again that we're aiming to keep the questions concise. In fact, I'm going to try to limit you to just 60 seconds. The main reason for that is because there are so many of you. So someone will be around in the aisles and in the on the wings with a microphone. Once you have that microphone, that means we are ready to accept your question. Okay? So if you have a question, raise your hand. The microphone will find you.
Thank you. Does Bermuda have the power to issue British citizenship, or are we just talking about Bermudian status?
Well, that would happen to be a question for someone in the Ministry of Home Affairs, I'm sure.
In terms of issuing Bermuda passports, you would have to be naturalized. So that's done through Government House in that instance. The Bermuda government has the power to issue status, not currently because there's no status provisions anymore in current law unless you're married to a Bermudian or you're the child of someone who has status under certain criteria. So any program for us would have to be done through the naturalization process. If you were to ever offer a passport, you'd have to be naturalized if you're not already a Commonwealth citizen, etc. So those are the things that would have to be considered.
Again, just raise your hand if you have a question. The microphone will find you. In the back of the room there.
My question is to Bernews. Correct me if I'm not right. I heard you talk about some of the risks involved in commercial immigration, that if persons would come into Bermuda specifically and their business gets going, did I hear you correctly say that sometimes their monies are not easily controlled? Did you say that was one of the risks?
So I mentioned that it's sometimes possible for them to withdraw the investment once they have received the permanent, whatever the non-conditional permanent status is. In practice, the implications of that are not always clear. So for example, if you have a number of investors who pool together their money to develop a new tourist resort. This is something that's been used in a number of the Caribbean countries that use this program. if it's a new construction, then that construction is still there, even if they decide to sell their share of it. So if the investment itself fails, then they take on the risk of that. If the investment is successful, then they will receive a return. So I don't think it necessarily matters in all cases if they do withdraw their money, especially if it's used for new building. But that is certainly a risk. In the United States, for example, there's a job creation requirement under their program, and you have to create 10 jobs. But after, you could employ 10 employees just for 2 years and then fire them when the program is over. For the most part, my understanding is that that's not extremely common, but it's definitely a risk, and it does sometimes happen.
I have one more question, and that's mainly the reason why I'm here this evening. There are lots of born Bermudians who are skilled, who are educated, who are highly intelligent and articulate, and are unemployed. Now, with you mentioning the commercial immigration piece, where would they fit with their skills and their expertise? What types of skills are these investors, what skills would they be bringing into my island?
Well, the goal of the investor program is to create jobs. So, and the investors would, one of the things that they would assess Bermuda on is whether it has the skills that are needed for the employment that they're likely to offer. And you can, the programs themselves vary. Some countries focus on specific sectors, for example. If there are areas in which they want to create jobs, then they may encourage investors to put their money in those places. In general, this is a common concern with all immigration, is that there will be displacement of people, the native population of the country. There's been a fair amount of statistical analysis that economists have done in a number of different countries that have received high levels of immigration. And generally, in almost all cases, they come to a relatively consistent result, which is that on average, there is not much displacement of native people, because when new people enter the economy, they occupy jobs, but they also would be creating them by expanding the economy. There are some concerns that definitely we have seen in some countries that at the low end of the labor market, if you have a lot of low-skilled immigration coming in, you get wage competition and competition for jobs in maybe the bottom 10 or 20% of the wage spectrum. But that's primarily from people coming in order to occupy low-wage jobs. What's slightly different about the commercial immigration or immigration of investors is that they're not really occupying jobs that would have existed in their absence. And so as a result, from that perspective, in the other countries that have introduced them, they've been extremely uncontroversial.
Thank you, Madeline.
Any other questions?
There's one over here.
Forgive me for my tardiness because I was late, but I hear you making mention of statistical information. Was that represented in your presentation, where there is the oldest country that has sort of implemented this type of thing, and maybe the newest country, and what, where is the real statistical data that you're talking about? Like, I hear you saying that, I have to take your word for it, but it'd be great to know where it was actually accounted from and be able to look at that.
Sure, so it depends what type of statistical information you're talking about, whether you're talking about information on investors and investor programs, or statistical information on the immigrants as a whole. So what I just referred to now was statistical information on immigrants as a whole and their impact across the economies. There is also some information on investor programs and how many people come through them. Generally, the numbers tend to be quite small. We're talking somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand, depending on the size of the program and what the eligibility criteria, how selective it is. But these are publicly available data.
Sir?
We'll go here first.
Yeah, that's good enough. You look at that on Google. That's simple stuff. My question is that you said earlier that if somebody was to cheat the system and keep their status, that would be bad. And I disagree. Because even if they was in the island, the money that they have in the island to increase revenue, to increase retail sales, to buy another house will still be a good thing. So there's no way you can lose from immigration at all. There's no way. And then the Bermudians will be getting the financial assistance, they'll be getting the social programs, you know, and so it's a no-lose situation, you know.
You have a question, or you just wanted to make that comment?
Yeah, I don't think there is. It's no.
Good evening, Mr. Good evening, fellow meetings and everyone else. This may not be directly at Chief Something, but maybe a member of the government can answer this question. I appreciate your presentation to me, but I've noticed with all of the potential controversies with the way the income may not be sustainable for some of the models, the one that looks like would be the most attractive to Bermuda will be the one that's least attractive to the immigrants, the investors. And why are we even looking at this? That's my question. You know, with the challenges we're having with this country, why are we even looking at this? I mean, if this is the best that the government has to offer, I think this is poor. Because when we're looking at investment, we have facilities already in place. If someone wants to invest significant dollars within our country, where if they want to immigrate into our country, there are channels already in place for those kinds of investors. So why are we looking at this program that opens us up to potential risks? People, unscrupulous people, because the most precious thing any country has to offer is its citizenship, more than any cash value we have. And we're willing to wager. I know you guys want gambling, but this is not something we need to gamble with.
Okay. I did hear a question in there. We'll see if we can.
Why are we looking at this?
Why are we sort of looking at this?
That's a very fair question, so thank you for that. All we've said today is when we're looking at ways to encourage direct inward investment and try and bring jobs to the table, we're looking at everything that is going on in other jurisdictions. That is it. We have provided you with the cheat sheet, if you have one, that shows what is going on in other jurisdictions, how some of those programs have been successful. I said at the beginning that we've made no decisions. This is simply an opportunity to hear facts. And if we don't think it's something that we should be considering, then we don't consider it. But we think it's important to lay out information that we're looking at as a way to increase direct investment. It's not the only program in terms of the government's agenda and its initiatives. We've laid a number of these things out in our throne speech and in our platforms to be elected. This is just one of those things that we're looking at. We think it's important to get the public's input at this stage. Sharing with you what we found, that's it. So we're looking at it, we think it's a good thing to share that information. That's all.
Could you say it?
Well, this is really a forum to ask questions to Ms. Selmshire.
Oh, okay.
Really, and then we'll have...
We had a question here.
Yes, good evening. I did come late, so I didn't hear the presentation, but I've been thinking about this, and a friend of mine called me to ask me was I coming. I wasn't going to come, because with this new government, most things that they've said is a done deal. Now, what I would like to know, what happens to the PRC people? I don't know if this question has been answered. They have to be here so many years. They got their papers by the time that they put in. Will they be offered the same status at $25,000? Because we are selling Bermuda very cheap. Very cheap. And if the Minister Faye saying, you know, in reference to the platform, it was in the platform. A lot of things have been in this party's platform, and they haven't changed. I would really like to know, and Bermuda would like to know, if this is a done deal. Because, Mr. Faye, are you a born Bermudian? Do you feel what Bermudians feel? No. Do you really feel? This is a small island. Why do we want to open it up to everybody? Go already open it up to the PRCs.
Okay,
What's the problem here?
I think we did get a question. So you want to know what happens to PRC holders?
Yes, and I would like a truthful answer. I would like an answer that they're going to stick by, because there's been too many things that has happened since this government came into power, and has changed.
Okay.
He said he brought it up, the platform. It was in the platform.
Okay, we'll give him a chance to answer.
I have said before, and I said it in the press releases, this is simply a discussion forum on the opportunities that may or may not arise for commercial immigration. That is it. I think we've been very straightforward with that. We said it both at the beginning, and I've also addressed it in the previous question. We had said this in our throne speech that we would commence a conversation. That's exactly what we're doing this evening. So in fairness and with all due respect, this is an opportunity to ask questions on a commercial immigration program. And there'll be other forums where we can tackle all the other issues that you clearly have with the OBA government. That's, I think, for a separate forum. I mean, tonight we have said that this is an opportunity to hear about a commercial immigration program. We've had an assumption come to make a presentation, and these questions should be directed at her respective what is going on with jurisdictions. That's what tonight's forum is about. I'll make it clear one more time that the government has not made any decisions in any way about these programs. It's an opportunity to share information.
Can I make a rebuttal to what you just said?
I'm sure you can speak with the minister after, but let's just see if we can stay on topic with this.
I want to stay on
Okay, well, we'll come back to you. We'll give someone else a chance to ask a question.
In your presentation, well, let me rephrase. In any of these policies that you discussed with any of the countries, do they give preference to citizens of particular countries, English-speaking, other English-speaking countries? And is there any reciprocity that could be offered to Bermudians if there was a short list of preferred countries from whom we would accept to offer this program? Has that ever been done?
Generally countries, especially high-income countries and traditional immigration destinations, try not to distinguish between the nationalities of people coming into the programs. Partly because some countries have a history of racial discrimination in their immigration laws, and they generally try to stay a distance away from that. That said, there are some reciprocity-based investment agreements, generally not the kind of thing we're talking about here, normally agreements to facilitate the movement of people associated with foreign business, especially if they're involved in trade as well. So that can be the case. There are also some cases worth mentioning. There are some nationals who are not allowed to apply for the program, mainly for security concerns. So Iranians, for example, have been suspended from the Syndicates and Levies program because it was the government's view that it's not possible to conduct sufficiently reliable due diligence on those people, so they are not allowed to apply.
I've been left with the microphone, which is dangerous.
Well, actually, we're going to move from here.
I have more questions.
If we exhaust all the questions, we'll come back to you.
Okay, a very quick question. Thank you for a very well balanced presentation. In your experience, citizens of which country generally apply for these benefits?
China is the number one source country. That's partly just because the sheer number of millionaires in China. It turns out you can get quite rich there, which was surprising to me, really. So that's the most common country. Russia has also been a common source country, particularly for European programs. And there another area where there are a lot of applicants is in the Middle East. A lot of those people are applying either in order to be able to do business and have facilitated travel, or because of the insurance policy idea that I mentioned, the fact that there's some turmoil in their countries or turmoil in the region, and they want to have the option to leave if they need to. So those are the main three areas. And there are some small other Asian countries as well. South Korea has consistent numbers in a lot of the programs. So those are the main sources.
We have a question over here. Go ahead.
Yes, I have one other question. I do some work with individuals that own homes in Bermuda, but own homes in Switzerland. What the Swiss, they have another passport, which I didn't see on this here. What it allows them to do is bring assets, tangible assets, such as paintings and other things that they own, into Switzerland and store them inside the country. And what they actually do in Bern, they actually build a massive storage warehouse on the edge of the airport. So these individuals can bring their private planes, and from Bermuda to Switzerland, Bern is an 8-hour direct flight. So they can bring anything over there, as long as it's legal, and store it. And the government generates revenue off of that. Have we ever looked at that?
the Swiss options are generally considered, it's not considered as attractive in a country to apply to because there aren't hard and fast rules. There's a lot of discretionary decision making, and often when people are applying to investor programs, they want to know exactly what the rules are. They want to know that if they apply now, the program will still exist and that the decision making will be consistent in a number of years' time when they're applying for permanent residence or citizenship. So there are people who have received citizenship in Switzerland through an investor route, but it's not, I wouldn't call it a program per se because it doesn't have transparent and consistent rules. Question right here, Glenn.
We have a question right here. Oh, I'm sorry. Over here first. I didn't see you standing there. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm not that tall. And good evening. Clearly, you've done an assessment across the world, and particularly interested in knowing for locations that are small like this jurisdiction and land as a commodity, do you actually have a formula or an assessment what you would say are here are the best ways to execute this if you did think to go this route, along with the pitfalls to prepare for and plan?
I think, as I said at the end of my presentation, the type of policy that makes sense really depends on the goals of the program. And so I think, being a small jurisdiction is just one of the factors that you would want to take into account. There are also considerations about whether, for example, countries with budget deficits are more likely to go for a cash-based model, especially if they want to solve that problem in the short term. Countries that are looking for to bring in individuals with business expertise are more likely to go for the kind of route with residence requirements. And I think as with any other areas of immigration policies, it's difficult for an outsider to come in and say, here's the program that makes sense for you. I think these are really decisions that need to be taken by the community.
I think if I can make some assumptions about your question, you were sort of talking about the density of the population as well.
Which ones were most relative to Bermuda?
Yeah. Are there any examples of countries where, because there was such a finite amount of resources available, they had to scale their program accordingly?
So Singapore is an interesting example in this regard because they have had, it's a very small jurisdiction, and they have had relatively high levels of immigration, particularly in some segments of the labor market. And they recently decided to scale back the options for immigration, not just for immigration and investors, but for immigration across the board. Generally, the number of investors tends to be quite small. So it's the other immigration policies, for example, work permits or family unification, that tend to have a bigger impact on the number of people who are buying houses. That said, some of the less well-advised programs, the ones, for example, that have met investors purely on the basis of buying property, they perhaps unsurprisingly have then been criticized for pushing up property prices. So, but those pitfalls should be relatively easy to avoid.
I can't see the microphone. Is there? Oh, you gave it up. Okay.
Senator, do you have a question? Right.
And unfortunately, I think this question is to my Senate partner, Minister Fay. How does this program, aside from offering complete citizenship, differ from the Job Makers for Incentive Act that's already in place?
First, let's make it clear that this is not a program that we have said we're doing. There are different options that have been put forward for us to discuss. Job Makers, as you well know, requires there to be an exemption for the company to which that individual is a member. That individual has to be seen as a job maker, in other words, provide a certain number of jobs over a period of time. There has to be a residency requirement of 10 years before they then get a PRC certificate. Now that Job Makers Act was introduced in 2011. We made some amendments to it, as you know. But that is residency-based with job creation for meetings with certain criteria that have been published.
Thank you. Mr. Minister, if you don't mind, just because the sinking fund is on your questionnaire, would you remind me what the sinking fund pays for?
Maybe you should stay over there.
I am going to do one thing, actually. I do see one of my colleagues at the back is the Minister of Finance. And if I could ask that the mic be passed to him, because I don't want to misspeak about how all of that is allocated. I think that's probably the best idea. Minister Richards, would you care to answer that question about the sinking fund?
Thank you. The sinking fund is money that's put aside to repay government debt. That's what the sinking fund is.
Okay, another question from the audience?
Good evening. My question is in two parts. Firstly, to the minister in relationship to the comment that he gave to Senator Diallo Rubin. Has the government, even though you're saying tonight is about having discussion, and then we've got part two tomorrow. I'm calling it part two tomorrow. Has the government decided on a model that they would like to work with? And the second part of the question is to Ms. Thompson, who made the presentation, in relationship to the size of Bermuda, recognizing that we have a population of 60,000 and a workforce of about 35,000 people now. Am I to understand that in printing on your document, when we look at the different models, whether it's automatic recognition regulation, partial recognition, limited scope recognition, or temporary access, are those some of the models you're referring to?
Those models are from a different publication that I wrote about the recognition of foreign qualifications. So that's about, for example, whether a doctor who's qualified in one jurisdiction is able to practice in another. So that's a different policy area from the one we're talking about of investors.
The answer to your question, Mr. Furman, is no. We've said repeatedly this is not intended to share information. In fact, I think, as I say, we met with Ms. Thompson this morning. The President of the Cabinet has heard these proposals as well, in terms of what those models are. So we thought we would get that information out there, hearing that we're here to share information and have a dialogue. So we will continue to do that. Part two is that no one thinks they're missing something. We're doing another forum tomorrow. We've invited business leaders, businesses, groups, the alphabet groups, unions, and the like, for another forum of similar types. This is probably one tomorrow, but the same information will be held and given out.
Well, we have a question over here.
Please.
Good evening. One of the things that we've noticed over the years is that we've given concessions to investors coming into Bermuda, especially to note was the Club Med hotel complex. They had 5 years, and in 3 years they were gone. My concern is how are we going to be able to recover these concessions? We continue to allow them, and then they don't live up to expectation. Are we going to be able to go after these people in the event that they shouldn't get to where we need to go?
So it depends on whether people have violated the terms of the immigration program that we're talking about, or whether they just reached a non-conditional status and then withdrew their money. If we're talking about people who do not fulfill the obligations that the program requires them to fulfill, then they would not be able to renew their status, and they would have to leave. If you're talking about people who fulfill their requirements for several years, but then after a certain amount of time, once they've received a non-conditional status, they decide not to, then that is just one of the risks of the program. It's not something that always happens, and if you have a new flow of investors coming in, it may not be a problem. But there's certainly no guarantee that the money that is invested through a program that ultimately leads to permanent status or citizenship, that money will stay forever, even if a large share of it does.
Well, forgive my layman follow-up. Does a commercial immigration program ever allow for citizenship to be revoked for violating the policy in the way you suggested?
Generally, the answer is no. Usually citizenship is citizenship, and countries are quite careful not to discriminate between different kinds of citizens. That said, there are some programs that have a requirement for renewing a passport. They have some minor residence requirement, for example, or they require you to maintain property in the country. But for the most part, if you want to impose rules on how people behave, then it's much easier to do that when they are not citizens, when they're still in some kind of temporary or permanent residence status.
Question right here.
Yes. I'm a bit perplexed in trying to understand this exercise tonight. More because there doesn't seem to be a foundation or guide in terms of what we're trying to achieve here. We're talking in limbo and round about different forms. I actually went on that website over the last 24 hours, and I understand that it's more directed at just recognizing people, migration, or immigrants from various places to various places. And I'm trying to understand how that relates to Bermuda when our issue is not so much on the migration of people. We're trying to establish ways of getting people to invest their money in this country. It's limited in how we can grow. So I'm trying to understand why the doors are so wide open in this barn, and we're not focusing on any particular direction, because I don't see the sense in this like this.
Well, I'm trying to piece together a question that maybe Ms. Sumption can answer based on what you offered. I certainly understand what you're saying, but you feel as if the process is directionless.
It's too wide open. I mean, the minister's already said that they're just looking, trying to get a survey from us. But a survey on what? It's like, there's no, which model are we supposed to analyze? Maybe let's put it that way.
Okay, well, we'll let the minister address that. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to have to buy you a new one.
Tonight, we are giving the community information on programs that can stimulate direct inward investment. These are programs that we have said have gone on around the world. It's something that we have said that we will start a conversation on so people understand the facts about what is going on in other jurisdictions in terms of how to stimulate investment and job opportunities. So rather than us come to you and say, we've made a decision, this is where we're going, we're saying, look, this is what we're looking at, you're being transparent about it and saying, these are the kinds of things that are being looked at only. And let's share that information as we get it so we can start a dialogue. I've been asked 3 or 4 times tonight to go with a decision. I made it very clear we have not. And it's sharing the information. People want information. Here we are giving it to you. That's the point. In terms of the survey, what we're saying is you've heard a bunch of information this evening. Let's get some feedback on what you've heard as to whether you think it's something that you might want to support. Maybe you say, I have no interest in it. You've seen a couple of models we've proposed. We have provided you with a cheat sheet and a presentation we'll put online as well so you can look at it again. I see people furiously scribbling notes. We can make sure that you get the information again. It's just looking at information. So we're not saying anything other than that. So it's not directions. It's saying, look at the form place. People interested in a process of getting information as to what government may be considering in certain areas. That's all. So I'm not sure I heard the question. I'm trying to address what I think is the question.
Let me have a question back here.
What I'm saying is, right now, it's just that. Can, Mrs. Assumption, can you pick out 3 or 4 countries that we have on this cheat sheet that would be relevant or similar to Bermuda?
Thank you very much.
That's a good question. I mean, it depends which aspect of Bermuda you're looking at. If there's no, I wouldn't say there's a single program that you should say this has all of the same considerations that you need to take in mind and you need to do this thing. But you don't need to adopt exactly the program. If you adopt a program at all, it wouldn't need to be exactly what's what another country does. You can adapt it to suit the circumstances. So if you're looking, for example, at a small, high-income country, then Singapore would be an interesting comparison. They have chosen to have a private sector investment model that does require residents in the country. And that if you're looking at a small island community, then somewhere like St. Kitts and Nevis would be would be appropriate. They have chosen a completely different model. They have chosen a cash-based program, which is primarily designed in order to provide opportunities for public infrastructure and development, including of the tourist sector. So it really depends a lot on what the government and the communities want to do with the program and what types of benefits they're looking to get out of it.
Thank you. Question here at the
Looking at the form that was given to us, all the countries I see on that form are all independent countries. Now, Bermuda being a dependent, being a territory of Great Britain, and Great Britain in the past had called us tax haven. What role does England play if you could go for citizenship for people to do that? What role does England play as far as immigration is concerned? Because I think the minister said something that a person had to get nationalization from England first. Would they permit this to happen? Because after all, we're not independent.
I think there are territory examples, right?
Thank you. Should there be a decision taken at some point or not, if you went with one of the models that's been talked about where you're offering a passport, in order to get a British Overseas Territories passport, that's issued for approval through the UK government by way of the naturalization process for a BOTC. Should a model be chosen whereby you have to have a residency requirement of 5 years to obtain that document, so you would get a BOT citizenship passport. Should a decision be taken, for example, to do with a strict residency requirement and offer, say, a permanent residency certificate, and of course, the UK government would have no say in that at all. So it's one of those, I think it's looking at each model as to what would or could be appropriate for Bermuda. Would people be satisfied having passports issued? Would people prefer to have a residency certificate? Or not at all? Or is this a program that we don't even want to consider? So those would all be policy considerations, quite rightly pointed out. But there would be, for a BOTC, and as I said, it would have to be a residency requirement under the British Nationality Act, which is separate and distinct, obviously, from the Immigration Protection Code.
Okay, I think we have a question over here on the side of the room.
Hi, I just wondered, when I look at these different models, I'm trying to, in my head, trying to figure out, well, what would be acceptable in Bermuda, just out of my head. And one of the things I'd like to know is, do you actually have people that are interested in, that have approached immigration or are actively looking for something in excess of what's already offered from job seekers? Is this an inquiry that you get, how can we come to Bermuda and live there?
Well, we've had some inquiries, but this is not directed at any particular individual or anything like that at all. It's simply, this is something that we had noticed looking around what other jurisdictions are doing to attract investment. This was a program that identified as we should look at this and see whether it's something that may or may not be suitable for Bermuda. It's as simple as that. It's just saying, look, this is what's happening elsewhere. Should we be looking at this? Are we going to miss a vote on something or not? Those kind of issues.
A question here on.
Yes, good evening. I'm just looking at what you presented and looking at what you particularly talked about in terms of limited land and all the rest of it. And I think you answered that in terms of the development hold-up in case they don't fulfill the requirements. I'm also looking at the Club Med of Palmetto Bay, which relatively had no penalties in terms of people not fulfilling their obligations. We're saying that somewhat going to fill that loophole someday, somehow. I hope I understand that to be correct. We also talked about the if we have some undesirable persons that could quite possibly affect us, each and every one of us, visa-free status. If we have a policy that doesn't look very good, it could affect each and every citizen's visa-free policy. Is that correct? Do I understand that to be correct? Is that what you were saying?
I think the risk of that happening really varies quite significantly depending on what type of program you're talking about. It is more of a risk if you're looking at a cash-based program that provides citizenship upfront. If you're talking about a program that requires people to live in the country for several years and one that conducts relatively thorough due diligence checks, that risk is much smaller, mainly because the countries that you're talking about that have that currently offer visa-free travel, they also have investor programs, and they tend to allow people to come in and spend somewhere, up to about 5 years in the country before receiving citizenship. So this would essentially be, that kind of program would be equivalent to what those other countries are offering, and so it's relatively unlikely that there would be a lot of criticism.
The last but not least, I think, in terms of the stats that you've given us, I didn't see any economic stats in terms of how many people are going to Nevis or whoever in the Caribbean, and what network have they brought to that particular community in terms of, I know what they're getting, but it's been a while since I bought a car and not knowing what I'm getting.
So the data is not always made public. In St. Kitts and Nevis, the amounts that have been reported by the government to have been raised through the program in the last couple of years have been between 140,000 East Caribbean dollars and 140 million and 200 million East Caribbean dollars. They don't release direct statistics on how many people apply for their programs. Other countries do release statistics. In the United States, it hovered around about 1,000 people a year for a while, and it's only in the last few years that since the programs have really been promoted and local governments have been trying to use it in order to finance specific projects that they were no longer able to finance with the economic crisis, and the budgets came under a lot more pressure. That after they started promoting those programs more actively, the numbers went up to several thousand, approaching the cap that they have of 10,000 people. So it really depends on the country. Some release data, some don't. Of the ones that do release data on the applicants, it's generally somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand people. And there are some programs, of course, that have exceptionally few applicants that have not proved particularly attractive as well. Who don't release their data also.
Do we have a cap on how many people we want?
You can have a cap. Some countries have a cap, some don't. If the numbers are perceived to be too high, then sometimes they can respond to that either by introducing a cap, or they can just make the criteria more difficult to meet. That sometimes is a sensible option. If there are too many people who want to apply for your program, then maybe it suggests that you're giving it away too cheaply, and so it would make sense to make the criteria more selective.
I think we have a question on this side of the room, and then we'll come.
Back here, Doug.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think it's good that we're having this discussion. And this is what this is. It's a discussion. And I was sitting here listening to what's been said tonight, and I would encourage everyone to keep in the back of their minds, why are we even having this discussion? It's an immigration matter, yes, but it's also a financial situation that we have to find ourselves in as a country. And we have some very serious challenges. We, as a country, Bermuda, are competing with the world. We have to look at what our competitors are doing. There's nothing wrong with looking at what our competitors are doing. So that is what my contribution is to this conversation. I'm here to support the minister. And I'm the Junior Minister for Home Affairs, so we're going to have this discussion. There's nothing wrong with having a discussion. No decisions have been made. But we want to get the buy-in and the input from Bermudians, because this is our country, we want what's best for our country. So it's not wrong with having a discussion. Thank you.
We have another question back here.
Okay, go ahead.
This question, thank you, Madeline. I think I heard most of the presentation, and it was thick. Thank you. It's similar to the question the gentleman here was asking. And I think there have been some questions about whether there are any reasonable comparables to Bermuda in the statistics that you've looked at so far and that are on the cheat sheet. It appears that there probably aren't. But in relation to the island nations that we see, Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, and with Antigua, this is a question. How long have those programs been in place? And is there any way that success or lack of success can now be measured? And I recognize that you said that there's not a lot of data. So, and there may not be data on the applicants, but I'm wondering if there's data on the economic impact overall and the results in terms of, did those programs meet the results that the nation desired that it meet?
So the IMF recently evaluated St. Kitts' economic performance as part of their regular monitoring process, and they refer to the citizenship by investment program that country runs as one of the major reasons that it was able to meet its financial targets. So the IMF, say that it's a success. Obviously, it depends what you mean by success. If it means being attractive enough to have a large number of applicants. Some programs have more applicants than others. Success could also be maintaining a program with a very good reputation. One of the reasons that people often point to St. Kitts as a good program is that it's been relatively free of scandals that some other programs have faced, and it's considered to have relatively good due diligence in place. So I think there are a number of different ways of measuring the success, both of the integrity of the program and of its actual impact. I think you asked how long the programs have been around. The St. Kitts one has been around since 1984. Dominica has also been around for a long time, although it's not been the same program. It was closed down and then reopened. Antigua and Grenada are both much newer. They were announced in the last year. Antigua is operational, and Grenada is just getting underway. Grenada did have a program previously, about 15 years ago, that was closed down, also related to some concerns about security, and so they've relaunched a different program now that they're hoping will have better security checks in place.
We're going up here to my hero of patience.
Good evening. I wouldn't pay too much attention to the IMF. I would consider it a criminal organization. And of course, you do know they derive from BIS, right? You know what it is? Bank of International Settlement. Which came about going to war. They create wars, and then they turn around.
I don't want to use
I'm not going to I'm just getting business. But there has been much disquiet in the Caribbean with the same program, particularly in St. Kitts that I know because I have lots of family down there. And what happens is the same thing happened in Bermuda with the offshore company. When these people come in, the prices go through the roof. People are losing their homes, losing their properties, and the prices are outstanding. And this is part of Bermuda's problem today through this offshore company business. These people come in with all this money splashing all over the place. And another thing with Bermuda is dangerous because Bermuda is not a homogenized racial country. It's separated. So most of the people that are going to come in with the money are people who are European. People call them white, but European. And they're going to stay with the Europeans, like with the Faye.
That's right.
He don't live in my neighborhood. And I'm not saying this to be discourteous to you, I'm just telling you the facts. And that's what happens.
Do you have a question?
Well, my question is how then? And that's why I heard someone from this area here speak about you telling us about a jurisdiction that we can take some that were comparable to ours. And the Caribbean is the perfect place. Because most of us in here that have the nice, beautiful colors to us are from the Caribbean generally, right? So that's where you need to stay if we are going to understand this thing any further.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can just sort of refashion your question if you'll allow me. Success as measured by the IMF might be different than success measured by a community organization, for example. How do you sort of mitigate the two so that all boats rise?
I think ultimately these are political decisions for the community to work out what are the intentions of the program. Does the community want a program that admits new residents, or is it more about raising pure investment and would prefer to have people who don't actually live there? Because in that case, you would want a program without a residence requirement. So I think that there's no objective answer to the question of what makes sense for Bermuda. I think these are questions that have to be decided at the political level.
Glenn, you have a question at the back here.
Good evening, everyone. My question is, and I'm not sure if it was asked before, but out of the other jurisdictions that have taken on one of these schemes or policies, how many of them have attached voting rights as part of the incentive program? And to Minister, if you were, I know you did say that this is not a decision, but if you were to go down this road with the country, would you attach voting rights to as one of the incentives?
Good question.
It depends on the type of program you're talking about. If you're looking at a program that offers temporary status, for example, that would not come with voting rights. Generally, that would also be the case for any program that has permanent residence but not citizenship. In almost all cases, it's only once you start talking about citizenship that there would be voting rights. Generally, as I said, citizenship is citizenship, and people would tend to have the same rights. That said, there can be some restrictions for people who don't actually live in the jurisdiction. They may not be able to vote. In St. Kitts, for example, if you have to spend 2 years actually resident there before you would be eligible to vote. So these things, there are different ways of designing the policy that might or might not include voting rights. Although generally, I think there's an argument for having only one status of citizenship that is equal between everyone.
I don't suppose you made a decision on the other piece of that question?
No, I think we've said repeatedly. We have simply come with information tonight. We have outlined a number of ways that in Bermuda, should you go down one way, you can be a VODC, for example, not active status, which gives you no voting rights. At the moment, you can have a PRC now, because those dates have passed. So there's no voting rights attached to that. So it's looking at, should we go down this road? What is the model that's most appropriate for Bermuda, if we went there at all? So this is the opportunity to share that information and simply get feedback. So, you can ask me questions, I can tell you the same answer every single time. This is simply an information sharing session.
Glenn, we have a question to the back here.
Good evening. Thank you for your presentation. I thought it was quite helpful. My question is, are there examples of any jurisdictions that implemented commercial immigration programs that subsequently decided to restrict the number of people who are accepted under the program, or otherwise add difficulties to restrict the number of people, or the kind of people that are either applying or being granted status or citizenship?
Yes, there are. So there are a number of different reasons that countries have done that in the past. Sometimes it's because they felt that the numbers were too large. So, for example, in Latvia, they've recently been talking about a cap on the number of investors because they were receiving several thousand people, and that was not what they'd expected. I mentioned earlier Singapore, which made the program, they didn't cap the program per se, but they made it more selective in response to a concern across the board, not just in the investor category, about the number of applicants that they were getting. A second reason some programs have been closed down is because of security concerns. If a program is well managed, this is not necessarily an issue, but there are certainly been cases, sometimes with scandals, often not necessarily about the applicants themselves, although there have been some involving criminal individuals who were admitted through the programs. In other cases, there have been concerns about the government mismanagement of the program. So, for example, someone being awarded an investor status on the basis of political relationships and the feeling that there was corruption. So, yes, there are a number of programs that have been closed down for that reason.
Question to the back here.
Yeah, I'm looking at this from a different angle. Has the government ever done a study of investors to see what they would like to have?
Sorry, this government?
Yes,
no.
Maybe you should maybe you can marry the two.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. At this stage, I say it's just presenting the information and then looking at it, as you quite rightly said, what would encourage investment? All we're saying is this is one of the programs that has encouraged investment on the jurisdiction.
I'm saying, wouldn't it be nice for our investors what they decide?
I agree with you. I agree.
We only have a few minutes left, so I would like to reserve that time for people who have not had the opportunity to ask a question. So if that is you, enthusiastically raise your hand. Here's your opportunity.
I just have a question. You're an advisor. You're an advisor as well, like it says research. You're an advisor. And yes?
I'm a researcher at a non-profit institute based in Washington, D.C. And we do research on all aspects of immigration. And we advise governments, but we're not a for-profit based organization.
So with the advisement, what are the criteria that you will come in and create the advisory? Like what are the steps, like what would you take into consideration to then advise on what way to, like what should be the money cap of what you would charge, for instance? How is that?
As I said, I think it's a lot of the decisions are ones that can't necessarily be made by an external person. If you're looking for, if you take something like the amount of money that should be charged, that would depend on what type of investment you're looking for. So you generally ask for a smaller amount of money if it's a cash-based program, compared to a private sector investment program. That if it's a private sector investment, the investor expects to get that money back over time, and so the threshold can be much higher. It also depends on what the expectations are as to how many applicants there should be. A government that wanted to take a cautious approach, for example, might start with a higher threshold and then think of lowering it over time if they didn't get as many applicants as they want. So it's, I wouldn't be able to just say, here's the number right now. It would be a process of deciding what makes most sense. Question right here in the middle again.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much for coming. I never knew what commercial immigration was, so it's been explained. This is an opportunity for all of us to get to know what it is, and an opportunity for us to understand if someone with vast amounts of money to come to Bermuda that wants something in return, this is a way that it can be done, and we can get things done, particularly to get Bermudians employed and get our economy stimulated. But what my real question is to you is, does governments of the world that have these programs, do they compare the success of the programs and which one is best for what size countries?
I don't think that the size of the country is necessarily the most important factor in determining what kind of program you want to have. I think it depends much more on issues like whether you want to admit people who are going to live permanently in the country versus whether you're looking for some other kind of relationship. I think a lot of this is a policy area that governments tend to review relatively often. There have been a lot of changes in the programs. There's a little bit of trial and error as people try and work out what type of program and what thresholds and eligibility criteria make most sense for them. To the extent that there's been a trajectory, I would say it's that some of the governments, particularly the high-income English-speaking countries, have tried to move their programs away from the more passive investment model, for example, accepting a cash donation of some kind, towards ones that bring in people who will actively contribute, maybe requiring, for example, that the investors themselves have a business background rather than just being wealthy individuals. So I think, to the extent that they've tried, what they believe about the success of the programs is reflected in the policy changes. It's that it's very important for many governments to try and bring in active contributors to the economy rather than just have a program that's purely based on an individual transaction.
We're going to go to the floor for one final question, but before we do, it just gives me an opportunity to let you know if you have questions, additional questions from Ms. Sumption. She did put her email address up on the slide, and there is a questionnaire circulating as well. Please fill it out and drop it off at the table at the back of the room on your way out. Also, if you'd like to email someone at the ministry, I have Richard Hazelwood's email address, who's standing right over here. His email address is rdhazelwood, HAZELWOOD, @gov.bm. All right, so one more question from the floor. Sir.
Thank you, Madeline, for the information you've shared. It's been very enlightening. And one thing I didn't know was that the take-up rate for these sort of programs was highest amongst the Chinese, the Russians, and the Arabs in the Middle East. I think when Bermudians think of immigration generally, we tend to think of immigration in the context of, as the gentleman mentioned, the Caribbean and or the US, the UK, and Canada. For my edification, could you let me know roughly what the take-up rate for these programs is from persons from the Caribbean generally, or the US, Canada, UK?
So in the countries that have data on the nationalities of their applicants, people from the Caribbean have not been significantly large in the numbers to really register at all. There are a fair number of Americans and Brits who participate in the programs, often going to the other country, Americans going to the UK and vice versa.
Well, thanks everyone for your participation in the public forum tonight. I think it was a fruitful discussion. There will be more information distributed publicly. And don't forget the questionnaire.